The Old Rose Tree by Mia Nieves Reyes. It was incredibly dark, the kind of darkness that you close your eyes to avoid the inevitable fear finding its way into your heart. My chest, my arms, my legs, my neck, my whole body felt uncomfortably stiff. Whenever I felt this way, the only thing I could do was count the capsules in my prescription bottle. Counting the number of pills left in the bottle always reassured me I was in the present, living in reality. When I was first diagnosed with my mental illness, not being able to tell fantasy from reality overtook my life. It wasn't until I met my sweet Rosalina when I truly accepted my fate. The beauty she brought into my life gave me the strength I needed to overcome my misfortune. No more will I hear the voices of strangers who I've never met. No more will I have to worry about the dark shadows following me home from work. No more will I have to smell non-existent blood dripping down the bathroom walls. We had lived together in the city for 4 years, and after all that time, I knew I had to marry her. We had made plans for a small wedding in the spring and organized a move to the rural area for summer. Rosalina was raised in the countryside and, unlike me, had a strong appreciation for nature. Being born in the suburbs and forced to move into the city, I never cared about trees or animals. All that concerned me were the finances and keeping my wife happy. Rosalina dreamt of raising a family away from the noisy city, in a cozy, isolated house near an orchard where the children enjoy playing, like she did when she was a child. Where we moved didn't matter to me, even if it meant leaving everything I had known. Finding an orchard near her family was easier than I thought it would be. Apparently, an old relative of Rosalina grew and tended to thousands of rose trees and was getting too old to handle such a big area, so he offered several yards of land for us to build upon. Without hesitating, we accepted and began planning out our dream house. Once that was finished, I refused to show Rosalina anything that had to do with the development. I wanted so badly to surprise her. I would visit the area every weekend and meet up with the old man who offered us a small clearing surrounded by tall rose trees that crowded each other. At first, I was disappointed by how limited the area was since the trees took up so much space. I spent days searching for a bigger clearing to build our dream house, but the orchard only had enough space for more trees. How could Rosalina grow up in a place like this? The only good element was the fresh smell of roses, but the trees were a problem, especially the roots that sprawled the entire ground. The number of times I tripped over tree roots was laughable, to the point where I entertained the idea of just cutting down all the trees. The idea was an echo in the back of my mind every time I found myself a new obstacle. Would Rosalina be happy knowing I had killed so many trees to build our perfect house? She was always so understanding with my mistakes, but this would be deliberate. I could leave a tree right in the middle of our backyard. Surely that's enough nature for our children to live healthy lives. Rosalina would never know. There was an old tree, thicker than any tree I had ever seen. Its roses bloomed entirely with its vibrant red color. That was the tree I left in the back of the house, not only because I couldn't chop through it, but because I knew Rosalina would never stand to see such a beauty be taken down. I was so proud of how it all turned out. I even used the wood of the trees I had derooted to make our dream house a reality. I made sure to hide any evidence of clearing the rose trees before I delivered the news to my wife. When Rosalina stepped into the house, her eyes burst into tears and she ran to hold me in her arms, mumbling about how much she loved it. For weeks we lived in paradise. Having the sunshine kindly wake us up in the morning instead of the loud city that never truly slept was my favorite part, along with the sound of birds chirping as my wonderful wife prepared my coffee before taking my pill of the day. At night, I slept the best in my entire life, despite not being used to hearing the screaming crickets. When I was alone, I would stand in the backyard staring at the great rose tree that decorated the space. It was a constant reminder of the lie my wife lived with unknowingly. The guilt rose only briefly, until I saw the smile on her freckled face that told me it was all worth it. Every day, while my wife tended the roses that grew on the old tree, the thought would haunt me. One day, the sunshine failed to wake me up. Instead, a foul odor overwhelmed my senses. I sat up, coughing out of disgust. It smelled like the inside of a garbage disposal. While I glanced around to figure out what could be emitting the worst smell I had ever inhaled, I realized that my wife wasn't laying beside me. I began to panic, quickly leaving the room to search for, if not my wife, the origin of that rotten smell. I found Rosalina, preparing my usual morning coffee. She turned with a loving smile that fell when she realized my distress. "Is everything okay, my love?" Rosalina asked worriedly. I tried to muster my voice, but the smell was so strong I couldn't even speak. How could Rosalina tolerate it? I settled with shaking my head to answer her and holding my nose tightly, forced out an explanation. "Smells like something is rotting." She tilted her head and began to sniff the air before shrugging. I gagged and ran out of the house to take in a deep breath of fresh air. My eyes widened in fear. I had thought the smell was inside the house, but the smell outside was much worse. The red roses that were tended to every day by Rosalina were dead on the ground. I tumbled closer to the tree and began hyperventilating. I woke up to my wife patting my forehead with a damp cloth gently. I sat up in fright and grabbed her by the shoulders. I started ranting about what I saw, the smell of rotting roses. My words tangled in one another. Rosalina frowned silently and stood me up. I began trembling and saying her name as my perfect wife guided me through the house. When I realized where she was taking me, I pulled away from her and held my nose while taking several steps away from the back door. Rosalina turned to me and then turned to open the door. She pointed toward the great tree that took up the center of the yard, its bright red roses in full bloom, neatly taken care of. We stood in place, both of us staring at each other with a mix of worry and confusion. After a while, my wife closed the door and stepped into the kitchen. She came back with a familiar orange bottle. That was the first episode since we moved into our new house. After that, Rosalina would wake me up before preparing my coffee just to make sure it wouldn't happen again. With our new routine, morning sunshine was no longer my alarm clock. Before taking my daily pill, I'd count every single capsule. Every evening, I'd watch Rosalina tend to the roses in our backyard, which used to be my favorite part of the day. Since my episode, I would glare at the roses and spend the rest of the day inside. One morning, I woke up before Rosalina, an occurrence that rarely ever happened. I stood up from the bed quietly and enjoyed the sight of my peaceful wife. Suddenly, a screeching sound came from the window. A large scratch took up most of the right corner of the glass. I looked at Rosalina, who was still asleep, and glanced back to the window. My breath began to quicken, but I forced myself to remain calm as I drew closer to the window pane. Could I have imagined the sound? Maybe it was always there. I examined the crack slowly, noticing it was too thick to ignore. While I was lost in thought, a dark figure slammed itself against the window. I jumped back and fell onto the floor afraid. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted towards the kitchen cabinet, making a mess of all the other medications. I found my daily pills and struggled to open the cap. I felt a presence behind me, my whole body tense. I struggled to breathe evenly. I finally opened the prescription bottle and laid all the capsules in the palm of my hand. I immediately swallowed one and turned around to face whatever was behind me. There was nothing. The sensation of having a looming monster behind me had faded away entirely. I sighed in relief and felt the capsules that had fallen into my hand. I absentmindedly started counting them out of habit. I felt around the edges of the pills as I reached the last capsule. My shoulders stiffened. The capsules varied in shapes. I opened the palm of my hand and saw that what I had swallowed was a seed. My heart froze. "Love, is that you?" Rosalina called out to me from the hallway. I hid the prescription bottle behind me, and as she slowly stepped into the kitchen, she smiled. "Good morning. Can't believe you woke up before me. Did you sleep well?" I nodded, my face paler than ever. She yawned and continued on like any other morning, preparing our usual breakfast and coffee. Afterwards, I couldn't sleep at night. I found myself watching the scratch on the window as if the thing that caused it would appear in the middle of the night. At one point, I shook Rosalina awake just to ask if she's noticed it before. "It's normal for glass windows to crack from cold weather," she mumbled in her sleep. I began seeing movements from the window, long, tentacle-like shadows creating squeaking sounds against the glass. Out of nervous frustration, I found myself sitting beside the window at night, knowing that I wouldn't be able to sleep with what was haunting me. I scowled at the old rose tree constantly whenever I felt like the shadows had subsided. Rosalina tried on most nights to get me to bed, worried I wasn't getting enough sleep. One midnight, she sat with me in the dark, keeping me company for as long as she could, but the exhaustion of the day had caught up to her. Wrapping her arms around my waist, my wife hid her tired face from me. "Please sleep," she whispered. The sound of her delicate voice was enough to convince me to let go of my resolve. I turned to kiss my wife, but a flash of lightning lit the room briefly, enough time for me to see my wife. Rosalina's face was entirely deformed. Her eyes were gouged out with thorns, blood trailing down her cheeks. She was unrecognizable, with sharp vines hanging out of the corners of her mouth. The usual smile that reassured me was pulled apart unnaturally. I pushed her against the bed with all the strength I had. I heard her gasp in shock, but that didn't stop me from turning on the lights. She stared at me, her perfect green eyes filled with tears, untouched on her beautiful freckled face. I felt the shame rush over me. My legs automatically moved out of the bedroom and into the kitchen in search for my prescription bottle. I held Rosalina the whole night, hoping we could console each other in our sleep. Since then, Rosalina hadn't convinced me to sleep again. Living inside our dream house and looking over to my wife was never the same. I continued, sitting by the window, not being able to understand what was happening to me. Despite already struggling with episodes, I had never experienced anything like this. I continuously tried to make sense of everything. One early morning, I grabbed my prescription bottle and noticed it was completely empty. I sighed. This meant I had to make my way back to the city to get a refill. I smiled. I needed a break from the countryside. I let Rosalina know I was leaving the next morning to get my prescription and would return by the end of the day. Rosalina nodded quietly, and we later said our goodbyes, knowing I'd be gone before she would wake in the morning. That night, the sound of the window was louder than ever before. I looked around the room and back to the window. I felt my usual fear turn into anger. I stared out the window, and my eyes landed on the old rose tree that took up my backyard. I clenched my fists tightly. This all started when we moved to the orchard after clearing the area to build our house. I ran out of the bedroom and into the storage room where I kept all the tools I used to build the house. It was dark, but I found the chainsaw and marched out of the house. I stood in front of the tree. I pulled on the string of the machine over and over again until it roared to life. I laughed to myself, wondering if this would really solve all my problems. I marched towards the old rose tree and felt myself being stopped. My foot got caught in a big tree root on the ground. I began my descent. My hands let go of the chainsaw, the darkness of the night not letting me see where it fell. The only hint I had was the sound of the tool. As I fell to the ground, I placed my right hand to stop my fall, but was met with a tight grip around my wrist. I tried to break free using my left hand, but it was held back as well. My feet were pulled from under me, and my ankles felt a twinge of pain. I forced myself to stand, but with every sudden movement, another part of me was held back. My chest, my arms, my legs, my neck. Suddenly, the tight grips began to pull in opposite directions. I began screaming in agony, shouting out for help as I coughed up blood. I sobbed in pain and called out for Rosalina. The roots of the old tree ripped me apart and buried me into the ground. It was incredibly dark, the kind of darkness that you close your eyes to avoid the inevitable fear tightening its way into your heart. Rosalina woke up the next morning missing her husband. She knew he had to get his prescription refill, but she had worried about her love ever since they moved to the rural area. She shook away her thoughts and began her day as usual. She made coffee for herself, checked her papers from work, and read letters from distant family members. The time to tend the roses was near. She decided on checking them an hour earlier since she didn't have her husband around to keep her company. She felt at peace, managing the beautiful tree her husband wanted them to have in their backyard. Rosalina never noticed the chainsaw hidden by the roots of the old rose tree. Thank you for listening to the Old Rose Tree audiobook.